Trump's levies have kicked in today, including an astonishing 102% tariff on China after they missed the deadline to withdraw their retaliatory tariffs, and 20% on the European Union. The combination of these explosive tariffs has sent the market sliding once again. Now, Shanker, I think we should probably make the best use of your expertise in global trade policy to ask the big questions. How has the landscape of global trade changed? And sort of looking long term, in your view, is it changing for the better or for the worse?
Well, first of all, it is a massive realignment that has happened with the announcement. It seems like centuries ago now, but it was only a week or so on the reciprocal unfair tariffs in particular. But I think to sort of break this down, I think you need to think of these tariffs in three sort of broad strands or three categories. The first is tariffs that are imposed for non-trade reasons. So this would be the early stage tariffs on things like fentanyl and so on. Those either don't get imposed or they're relatively short-lived. Then you have the tariffs for general revenue, which we didn't hear much about, but that may be coming back. And then the final thing is the unfair trade and reciprocal tariffs. And the unfair trade and reciprocal tariffs, I think, they're the result of long-standing complaints the US has had about trade practices around the world. So the interesting thing is the book that he waived in the announcement was the National Trade Estimate, which has been produced by USTR for 40 years. I don't think it's ever been waived from the presidential podium before, and probably has not ever been read by a president before. But it's an inventory of foreign country trade barriers. And I think he also said it made for very sad reading. And actually, in some senses, that's correct, because if you go back 30 years and you read the country's entries in the National Trade Estimate, they haven't really changed. In fact, if anything, they got worse. So I think that the administration is essentially saying what we've tried to do in the past, and I know the focus is on tariffs because that's the word he uses, but it's important to recognize that most of this is about non-tariff barriers and regulatory barriers and all of these other things. Scott Bessent said this, the Chinese tariff is 5%, but no one thinks that's an open and competitive market. It's because of these other things that are the problem. And what the president would say is, okay, we've tried to lower these things for 30 years. We've had no success whatsoever. In fact, they've gotten worse. So therefore, we need to try something different. And actually, one might argue it goes back even longer than 30 years. It goes right back to the Reagan era structural impediments initiative with Japan, which did not yield any change to the fundamental Japanese economic model. So that's the reason why these tariffs are in place. One can quibble with the calculation of the formula that was used, but it is certainly not wrong to say that US exports have been suppressed by distortions in other markets, and US imports have been artificially increased by distortions in other markets. So some part of that deficit is attributable to these kinds of things. How much is a question, and certainly my view would be, if the result of all of this is that countries do deals, as we're seeing the Japanese and the Koreans doing now, that lead to a reduction in those distortions in their markets and also a reduction in the US tariff, then that's a world where you've overall improved your trade openness, you've improved competition, you've improved property rights protection. That would be a good outcome. On the other hand, if countries don't really understand what's happening here, and this would be true, I think, of the EU and China, and they retaliate but don't change any of those underlying distortionary practices, then you're in a world of massive tariff retaliation, no real change to those distortions, and that's a very damaging and dangerous, world. And we're going to be between those two potential scenarios. And what's challenging for the world is there isn't really a middle ground. It's going to be one or the other.
So do you think there is still room for negotiation? Does it look to you like China is effectively being made an example of?
Well, I think, if you look at and it's particularly the Asian economies and the model, the sort of mercantilist, export-led, low currency, deliberate suppression of currency for export advantage, that model the US has really, and particularly the Trump administration, has really rejected. And Japan and Korea have obviously got a totally different approach to China. And I suspect that because those deals are being led by Scott Bessent and Jameson Greer, so the Treasury Secretary and USTR, probably will get a deal. I think you'll get a deal with Japan and Korea sort of in the maybe May, June kind of time frame. I think that the president wants to do a deal with China, but I think he is in leverage gaining mode. I think there are two modes here. There's leverage gaining mode and then there's deal mode. Whether they can do a deal with China will depend on whether China can maneuver itself into the deal zone. That's going to be very challenging because that would require a very big change in China's economic model, which I don't see them embracing anytime soon. I mean, some of that to some extent is also true of the EU's response, which is very much, I think we're going to see next week, the start of retaliation from the EU, and it may go down the same path that we're seeing with China now.
You were obviously an advocate for a hard Brexit. What would you make of the scenario whereby this new sort of world trade landscape ends up pushing us closer to the EU?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't agree with the characterization of hard Brexit. I mean, I think there's a way to leave the EU that is one that makes economic sense, and that requires you to have maximum flexibility in terms of particularly your regulatory regime, because obviously the biggest gains of leaving the EU are in your pro-competitive regulatory regime. You know what you can do to make that better and more pro-competitive. But I think that's also where the problem lies for the UK, which is the more I think there's a lot they can do to improve the relationship with the EU, and all of that would not have any effect on a US deal. So there's mutual recognition that they can do. There's all kinds of defense deals and other things, even mobility agreements. I mean, anything that doesn't compromise your independent trade policy and your domestic regulatory policy, I would say there better be a really good reason not to do it. And I would advocate doing all of those things. The one thing that I would not do is the one thing they seem to be doing, which is the dynamic alignment to European regulation in whatever sector it is. And if it's in the SPS sector, the sanitary, phytosanitary, the animal and plant health kind of sector, that is amongst the biggest, most important asks that the US has had for decades. It isn't a new thing. That entry of the UK and the EU, when the UK was part of the EU, in the national trade estimate, the European Union's regulatory regime was number one in terms of the complaints of US business. So I was a cleared advisor to the US trade representative between 2009 and 2015, and we spent 90% of our time on the European regulatory system in terms of US complaints. So if you tie yourself to the very thing that is the biggest source of complaints from the US private business sector, it's going to be very difficult to do any kind of deal to lower your tariffs. So they have to be very careful to watch that. But fortunately, they have a lot of wiggle room to do lots of other things with the EU and improve the trade relationship with the EU. There's any number of things that you would do. You could agree a services agreement, you could agree mobility agreements, and lots of things that you would do. But that's the one thing I would say: don't do that, because that will be a red rag to the Trump administration ball and compromise any ability to get a deal done.
Thank you, Shanker, and thank you very much for listening.